Welcome to these key takeaways from the Guidelines for Terminology Policies, Formulating and Implementing Terminology Policy for Language Communities, a resource developed by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, prepared by Infoterm and published in 2005. This presentation is a collection of the key takeaways from that resource. Now, when thinking about the impetus for writing terminology policy with an eye toward corporate and social responsibility, some things need to be taken into account about how the creation of linguistic assets in various mother languages, or the lack thereof of those resources, impacts the economic stability and viability of communities of people who speak languages. These pull quotes from the preface of the UNESCO paper are particularly important when thinking about the fact that there are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world, and about 1,000 of those languages can be represented online. So pull quote 1 states, "The digital divide almost invariably co-occurs with inequality of access to information and knowledge, which is in turn associated with inequality in linguistic access. Inadequate terminology is one key factor in the inequality of linguistic access, and it results in functional illiteracy in the contexts of accessing information and using computers." Pull quote 2 states, "People whose mother tongue is not or not sufficiently developed from the point of view of terminology and special purpose languages, or SPL, or who are denied the use of their mother tongue in education and training for accessing information or interacting in their workplaces tend to be disadvantaged." Pull quote 3, "In most cases, limitation in the use of a language to folklore or to the family sphere means that such a language will be inadequate to support professional communication. Similarly, a language that lags behind in its terminology for a given domain risks losing the ability to communicate in that subject in its language over time." So thinking about language under the impact of globalization, the UNESCO paper by Infoterm essentially paints the picture of a concept map about different types of language. So as you know, language is the primary method of human communication, and it's also a primary means of expressing cultural identity. Language can be divided into two types: general purpose language, which is everyday language that we use to communicate in societies, and special purpose language, or specialized language used to communicate within a specific professional domain. Special purpose language is used, as I said, for domain communication. It's also used for the representation of specialized knowledge, and it gives access to specialized information. So special purpose language and having well-developed special purpose language is important to the vitality of a language. Terminology is crucial whenever specialized knowledge is generated through research and development, when it's used, when it's published, when specialized knowledge is recorded and processed in databases, passed on through training or teaching, when it's implemented in technology and knowledge transfers, and when specialized knowledge is translated and interpreted. A couple more pull quotes that just speak to the importance of having terminology and linguistic assets available in a language for the economic vitality of that language, and just the survival of that language as a language used to communicate about life. Pull quote 1, "As science and technology are the basis of economic and societal development, the interaction between language and economic activity is, in general terms, quite self-evident. It is increasingly recognized that the relative strength of the language of a given language community tends to reflect, after a certain time lag, the economic performance of that language community." I'll go on. "A language community whose language has not developed scientific and technical terminologies is unavoidably forced to use some other more developed foreign language for domain communication. As communication in general today is highly supported by information and communication technologies, ICTs, the lack of terminology indirectly but inevitably establishes digital divides, which can manifest themselves in different ways." So a question for consideration that I'd like you to take a moment, pause the video, and reflect upon. How do the digital divides that indirectly result from the lack of terminology manifest themselves in societies and economies? In terms of terminology strategy, there is an important pull quote from the guidelines that I wanted to share. It reads, "Experience shows that different user groups need terminological data having different degrees of complexity and detail for different purposes. It is therefore highly economical to prepare multi-purpose terminological data from the outset for different users and applications." I appreciate this statement because it makes me think about the strategy of term base formation and thinking about the data categories that I would include in a term base and about which I would collect information about terms. If I have a central primary database in which I'm collecting information into data categories that address the needs of a wide variety of terminology database users, what I can later do is display customized views of that data collected so that specific user groups are only seeing the data that is pertinent to them. This is an important methodology for building out really robust terminology over time. In terms of basic concepts, the UNESCO paper presents and defines a wide variety of concepts related to terminology policy. You can see some examples of those basic concepts on this slide, including things like communication, language engineering, terminology science, terminology services, and national terminology policy, to name a few. To solidify your understanding, it would be a really good idea to review the definitions of the terms on this slide, and you could even take it a step further by situating these designations into a concept system that represents the relationship among the concepts presented. In terms of language planning and terminology planning, the UNESCO paper goes into quite a bit of detail when discussing the relationship about these two types of communication planning. Language planning is needed to promote multilingualism, education, and equal access to communication technologies within societies or organizations. And there's a wide variety of objectives within language planning that can include the implementation of mother tongue education, creating an optimal learning environment for the teaching of math and science, improving the qualifications of workers, improving the economic power of a nation, ensuring access to democracy, giving people access to a wide variety of text types in their primary language. Now, terminology planning is closely related to language planning, and these two types of planning definitely complement one another. So for terminology planning, it's important to note that terminologies are used to facilitate understanding, information retrieval, documentation, communication, and education. And that terminology planning is something that needs to take place on a continual basis, since the way that concepts are formed and conceptualized within specialized domains constantly changes. It's also important to note that when doing terminology planning, that's taking time to do comparative analysis to see where the way that concepts are represented in different languages are not fully equivalent is an important step that needs to take place so that more accurate translations and interpretations can be produced. Translation and interpretations that attend to these nuances in differences in the way that languages conceptualize knowledge. And when conducting terminology planning, it's super important to integrate the views of linguists, terminologists, domain experts, etc. Now, here's another question for consideration when thinking about what you've heard to this point about the terminology policy paper. The UNESCO guidelines advise that basic terms that are needed most urgently should generally be prepared first when first creating policy. So these include terms that relate to education, hygiene, public health, or public transportation. What are some other areas for which term creation or standardization would be a top priority? So here's another question for consideration. The UNESCO terminology policy guidelines state, like other resources, language too has, if handled properly, a job creating power. I'd like you to reflect for a moment. How does the proper handling of terminology help to create jobs? That concludes this presentation on key takeaways from UNESCO's guidelines on terminology policy. Thank you.